So, how'd the first part go? 120 killed and 200 captured. Okay, how many men did they have killed? 0? So, success then, huh? Yeah. September 17th, 1950. For 2 months now, Douglas MacArthur has been preparing what he hopes to be his masterstroke, an amphibious invasion far behind the North Korean lines at Incheon. And this week it happens. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the North Korean offensive around the Pusan Perimeter continued, but it lost a lot of steam, and there were heavy UN counterattacks. But what the UN forces were really preparing for was Operation Chromite, that amphibious invasion of Incheon. We saw Eugene Clark and his force occupy Yeongdo and Palmi-do off the coast near Incheon, and he began secretly gathering local intel ahead of the landings. But the North Koreans have figured out that he's around, and they send like 80 men in 6 junks to retake Yeongdo. Clark leads his flotilla of 5 junks out to intercept them, and they capture 2 of the 6 and sink the other 4. He is aware that another larger assault will undoubtedly come, so he moves his whole operation to Palmi-do, and at 12:50, past midnight, as the 15th begins, they light the lighthouse to guide the invasion fleet up the Flying Fish Channel. Now, because of the tides, this is one of only a very few days this month the operation can even take place, and they are trying to maintain surprise. UN ships have been bombarding Incheon off and on for a few weeks, and there are diversionary landings, like on the 12th at Kunsan with some Royal Marines and a company of American infantry. As for the preliminary aerial bombardment that began the last day of last week, it just destroys Wolmi-do the first 2 days of this week. From the 13th, surface ships join in the festivities. American heavy cruisers Toledo and Rochester and British light cruisers Kenya and Jamaica head up the Flying Fish Channel and then anchor offshore the island and begin blasting away with the American 8-inch and British 6-inch guns. There is also a destroyer group of 6 that sails in and hits the island from close up with 5-inch guns. The naval forces attack again the 14th, but there is no return fire, no real signs of life from the island. But how much damage have they really done? And is their enemy still strong there? Well, the 1st Marine Division leaves Kobe, Japan, the 11th. U.S. 7th Infantry Division leaves Yokohama the same day. And on the 12th, the 5th Marine Regiment leaves Pusan. These are the invasion forces. 30 minutes past midnight on the 13th of September, with MacArthur and party aboard, the command ship McKinley weighed anchor at Sasebo. The 10th U.S. Army Corps, 70,000 men, was at sea. It had been formed from scratch, operating against time, manpower, and every known logistic difficulty, and its very conception embodied the best of American military capability. And that last is pretty true, actually. Let's keep in mind that we've seen the worst sides of the American military these past couple months in Korea. So pulling this off is a feat of legendary proportions. It actually involves more ships and more men than most of the Pacific Island operations of World War II. And I think that because it is such a success and achieved at such little cost, there's at least some tendency to discount the incredible hazards overcome to pull it off, and MacArthur's absolute refusal to budge from his plans, even though the Navy and Marines never fully accepted it. And yes, it is a huge success and is achieved at very little cost. The invasion begins the morning of the 15th, as the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines goes ashore on Wolmi-do. There is very little resistance, and they take the island in exactly 1 hour and 25 minutes. The bombardment has shattered the North Koreans there. The Marines kill at least 120 and capture 200 for the cost of 17 wounded and 0 killed. And now they dig in and wait. Remember, it's 11 hours until the next tide, and they have to wait that out before they can attack Incheon itself. The fleet has to go back down the channel to avoid being stuck in the mud flats when the tide goes out. So the Marines are alone now. Not cut off, though, since overwhelming air power is in the skies to interdict any attempt to hit them. The main landing had peculiar difficulties of its own. The Marines would have to get up a stone seawall and attack directly into a built-up area with night coming on. They also had to be supported by immediate landings of LSTs, which would then be grounded overnight on the mud flats as the tide receded. The Navy was so worried about leaving its ships high and dry possibly losing them to enemy fire, that it used for the landing 8 old LSTs that had previously been decommissioned and had been kicking around Japanese waters, slowly rusting for the last 5 years. One of them actually had to be towed to Incheon. When the tide comes in, the Marines hit the 2 invasion beaches, red and blue. Red is right in the city, and blue to the south. They smash into the seawall, quite literally in many cases, with the LSTs sometimes breaking through it. The Marines race up ladders and grappling ropes, the LSTs peppering the shore with 20 and 40 millimeter guns. At 5:33 p.m., the 5th Marines hit Red Beach. They do take heavy return fire, and the tanks and bulldozers and things are unloaded under fire. But quick Marine infiltration of the buildings near the seawall begins taking out the enemy machine guns and snipers. 20 minutes after hitting the shore, they have taken Cemetery Hill, a major early objective. The 1st Marines climb the seawall at Blue Beach and begin sweeping around the city from the south so they can cut the Incheon-Seoul highway. Their main enemy is the rapidly approaching darkness of night. But by 1:30 that night, they've surrounded the city and taken their initial objectives. This operation is a real success story for the Marines and the Navy. They've taken 20 killed and 174 wounded, many of those, unfortunately, from spooked gunners on their own LSTs. Of course, one big factor in success is that there really aren't that many of the enemy in the area, and they have been well surprised. In nearby Seoul, there are maybe 5,000 of them, 500 or so around Kimpo Airfield, and 1,000 or so at Incheon. Maybe 1,000 more in the general Incheon area. So they have been outnumbered and also completely outgunned. Although let's not forget that there have been many cases in the past where a handful of soldiers can hold back a great invading tide. Some of the slaughters at Gallipoli spring to mind. Anyhow, as the 16th dawns, 10th Corps has a beachhead some 25 kilometers from Seoul, and Ray Murray's 5th Marine Regiment and Chesty Puller's 1st push inland for their next objectives. ROK Special Marines enter Incheon to mop up. The ROK is the South Korean forces. T.R. Fehrenbach writes, "They do this with such a vengeance that for a few hours, nobody, friend or foe, is safe." As for the North Koreans, well, we will see their real reaction next week. But this landing force here, this is to be the anvil, and Walton Walker's 8th Army down in the Pusan Perimeter is to be the hammer. That's the plan. See, that army is to begin a big counterattack the 16th, the day after Incheon. This is designed to pin down the KPA there in place so they can't reinforce Incheon. And they also figure the invasion will adversely affect KPA morale at just the right time. They are wrong about that for the simple reason that the North Korean commanders just don't tell their troops that Incheon has even happened. In fact, there are quite a few North Korean attacks in the perimeter the 16th, but I'm getting ahead of myself. By the 16th, there are like 150,000 UN troops down there, right? There are the 4 US divisions, 6 ROK divisions, and the British 27 Brigade. They have an overwhelming superiority in armor and artillery in terms of numbers over the KPA. But the batteries are all on ammunition rationing because there is a shortage of that. As for the force facing them, well, it's around 70,000 men. American command figures, though, that most of the original men from June are gone, and there are maybe 30% of them left, and the rest are new conscripts who do not want to fight. They're pretty correct about that, but those guys do not desert either, since anyone either trying to desert or not instantly obeying an order is shot on the spot by North Korean NCOs. They are not correct about the overall numbers, though. Intelligence estimate of enemy strength was more than 100,000 combat troops with 75% equipment. The same estimate indicated that the enemy still held the initiative and was not likely to lose it in the immediate future. 8th Army, however, had been on the defensive too long. Defense had been almost a state of mind with high officers. They found it hard to adjust to taking the initiative. We saw that Daegu was in pretty serious danger as last week ended, and the fight near there continues this week. In fact, by the 12th, the North Korean 13th Division has occupied Hill 314. From there, they can actually see Daegu, and the hill commands the Daegu Valley, with steep slopes on all sides. It is the 3rd Battalion 7th Cavalry from 1st Cavalry Division that gets the call to take the hill. The 2 lead companies, I and L, make their attacks and climb the hill under heavy mortar fire. This results in bloody and brutal hand-to-hand combat. And the third time, Love Company goes up the hill, they take it, and the enemy disappears. There are about 40 men left in each Love and Item companies. But at 3:20 in the afternoon, the hill is reported secure. This has been the gravest threat to Daegu, and it has been contained. The People's Army had almost shot its bolt. Less than 30% of the old China veterans remained, and these were dirty, tired, hungry, and in rags. Now, only frequent summary executions and the threat of death could hold the newly drafted trainees in line. The Inmingun had made its supreme effort and failed, and the Americans were just beginning to fight. The Inmingun is the KPA, the North Korean army. The UN forces have a 2-to-1 edge in manpower and a 5-to-1 edge in firepower. They control both the sea and the skies. It would seem that to now break out of the Pusan Perimeter, they just need a new attitude. They have a fairly straightforward attack plan. The main attacks are to be along the Daegu, Daejeon, Suwon axis and to eventually link up with 10th Corps. They will be following the path 8th Army was pushed back along in July. They is 1st Corps under Frank Milburn that's just been activated. He's got the U.S. 24th Infantry and 1st Cavalry Divisions, the ROK 1st Division, the 5th Regimental Combat Team, and the British 27th Brigade. In the south of the perimeter, the U.S. 2nd and 25th Divisions will remain, and next week will fall under a newly created 9th Corps. The morning of the 16th, the KPA attack once again in the Naktong Bulge, and the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division repulses their attacks, but then launches its own big attack. By mid-afternoon, the KPA forces are leaving their defenses and heading for the river, but that only gets them where they can be hit from above by F-51 strafing and dropping napalm. Today, as the week ends, they are hit hard trying to cross the Naktong River. This all happens quickly. George Peplo's 38th Infantry pushes the fastest all the way to the river. The 23rd and 9th Regiments more slowly, but the defenses melt in front of them as the week ends. Further north, the 5th Regimental Combat Team attacks Hill 268 today the 16th. If they can take it, they may well take Wigwam. We shall see. 13,000 men have hit Incheon and taken it with ease from a slumbering enemy. And MacArthur has his frustrations with Walker and 8th Army and their progress breaking out. That is nothing at all compared with Walker's frustration, though. He has had his units withdrawn when he needs them the most, and supplies diverted away from his forces for the Incheon operation. And when he gets his first briefing about Incheon the 17th, today, and learns how lightly defended it was, he explodes. They expended more ammunition to kill a handful of green troops at Wolmi-do and Incheon than I've been given to defeat 90% of the North Korean army. His lack of equipment really drives him nuts, specifically bridging equipment. He is supposed to send his whole army across the Naktong River, but priority for bridging equipment has gone to 10th Corps up at Incheon for if and when they reach and want to cross the Han River. But it's not just that. The thing about it that makes him the most furious is that these sort of decisions have been made by the Chief of Staff's office. Who is MacArthur's Chief of Staff? Edward Almond. Who commands 10th Corps up at Incheon? Edward Almond. Walker, and I guess he has some just cause, feels like the dice are loaded against him. Some of you may be wondering, wait, you told us last week that Mao Zedong's Chinese communists figured out already in late August what was going to happen at Incheon, and they told North Korean leader Kim Il-sung. But the operation worked perfectly. What's the story there? It was Lei Ying-fu on Mao's staff who figured the whole thing out and told Zhao Enlai, who told Mao, who told Zhao to tell Kim Il-sung. Some of Kim's Russian advisors were making similar suggestions, but none of this seemed to move Kim. This was hardly surprising. After all, he had risen to power not by battlefield brilliance, but by managing to survive in a cruel political era, and then by being essentially ideologically obedient. Kim held power largely through the largesse of the Red Army. He had not learned anywhere near as many lessons on his way to power as Mao. Mao actually met with a senior Soviet advisor twice in mid-August, since he thought the North Koreans had achieved about all they were going to achieve, and his role in the war might soon change. Like, that if the U.S. kept sending in more troops, the KPA would need direct Chinese assistance just to hold on. He also met with a North Korean representative in China and sort of laid into him for Kim not seeking his advice earlier, which would have been to have more reserves if they were going to attack on such a broad front, and to put less effort into taking territory and more effort on destroying the enemy, stuff like that. But he also talked up current stuff, like that he sees Kimpo Airfield as quite vulnerable, and even pointed at a map and said Incheon was the likely target. Kim, though, did nothing about such an eventuality, not even simply mining Incheon Harbor or the channels. The Chinese certainly understood what was happening in Korea better than Kim did. One of the problems in a totalitarian system like that of North Korea was that bad news tended not to filter back with much accuracy from the front to higher commands. That could be true of democratic societies as well, but it was all the more true of deeply hierarchical ones like North Korea. Instead, the news was sanitized step by step as it moved upwards. Thus, on September 4th, when Mao's emissary told Kim that the war was locked in a stalemate in the Pusan area, the Korean leader did not believe him. His great offensive was just starting and would soon break the deadlock. That emissary, Jai Junwoo, mentioned the possibility of a UN attack behind KPA lines, and Kim told him, "We estimate that presently a US counterattack is not possible. They do not possess sufficient troop support, and therefore a landing to our rear ports would be difficult." He went back to China at the end of last week, and Kim did nothing to prepare to stop Operation Chromite. So this week ends with that operation being a complete success in its initial objectives, and the North Koreans now have tens of thousands of the enemy far to their rear, threatening their whole logistical system. Their own offensive down at the perimeter has lost momentum, and the UN forces have kicked them out of the Naktong Bulge. Boy, things can change really quickly, can't they? The whole picture of this war looks radically different from how it did just a week ago. The entire position of the KPA down south is suddenly pretty tenuous. They do have a lot of force, though. Can they gather it, or turn it around, or assemble it in time to destroy this threat from Incheon? Can they? See you next week.